I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my apartment, adjusting the navy blue gown that felt too elegant for someone whose life had been systematically dismantled 6 months ago. The dress hugged my figure perfectly, courtesy of my best friend Maya, who insisted I couldn't attend the Hartwell Foundation's annual charity auction, looking like a ghost haunting a conservation lab. Her words, not mine. I touched up the red lipstick that was supposed to make me look confident and alive, but my eyes told a different story. They were dull, lifeless, like pigments that had oxidized beyond restoration. I practiced my smile in the mirror for the 100th time that week. Teeth visible, corners lifted, eyes slightly crinkled. Technically perfect. Emotionally hollow. But it would have to do. The art world didn't care about your pain. It cared about your performance. The Hartwell Foundation Gala was being held at the Pemberton Estate, a sprawling mansion on the outskirts of the city that had been converted into a private event venue for the obscenely wealthy. I arrived fashionably late, which was actually just regular late because I'd spent 45 minutes in my car working up the courage to walk through those doors. The moment I stepped inside, I was assaulted by the familiar scent of old money, expensive perfume, aged wine, and that peculiar smell of desperation masked as philanthropy. Crystal chandeliers cast everything in a warm, forgiving light. String quartet music floated through the air like it was being painted by Monet himself. Everywhere I looked, I saw people I used to know, people who used to respect me, people who now whispered behind champagne flutes when I passed. 6 months ago, I was Iris Hale, the wunderkind of art restoration, the 37-year-old specialist who could bring destroyed masterpieces back from the dead. Museums flew me across continents. Private collectors paid obscene amounts for my expertise. I'd given a TED talk about the ethics of restoration that had 3 million views. I was at the top of my field, working alongside my mentor, Professor Malcolm Winters, a man who'd taught me everything about seeing beyond the damage to the original intent of the artist. Then the scandal hit. 8 men, all connected to a sophisticated art forgery ring, had been using my restoration techniques to pass off fakes as authenticated pieces. They'd stolen my research, my methods, my reputation. Worse, they'd implicated Malcolm, suggesting he was complicit. The accusation alone killed him. He had a heart attack in his study, surrounded by the paintings he loved, 3 days after the first article ran. The police investigation cleared him posthumously, but the damage was done. My career was in ruins. The art world had turned its back on both of us. I grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter and downed half of it immediately. Dutch courage, my grandmother used to call it. I needed all the courage I could manufacture tonight, because this gala was full of people who either pitied me or blamed me, or both. I spotted Marcus Doyle near the Baroque paintings, one of the 8 men who'd destroyed my life. He was laughing, actually laughing, with a group of collectors, completely unbothered by the fact that his forgery operation had stolen 5 years of my research and driven a good man to his grave. The police said they didn't have enough evidence. The district attorney said it was a complex white-collar case that would take years to build. Meanwhile, Marcus and his associates walked free, attended galas, and continued to operate in the shadows of the legitimate art world. I turned away before I did something stupid like throw my champagne in his face. That's when I felt it. The weight of being watched. Not the casual glances I'd been receiving all night, but something more focused, more intense, like a laser beam on the back of my neck. I turned slowly, scanning the crowd, and that's when I saw him. He was standing near the French doors that led to the garden terrace, a man I'd never seen before, but who somehow looked like he owned the entire estate and everyone in it. Tall, probably 6'2", with dark hair swept back in that effortlessly elegant way that suggested either excellent genetics or an expensive stylist. He wore a black tuxedo that fit him like it had been sewn directly onto his body by Italian tailors, who understood that some men were meant to look dangerous in formal wear. But it was his eyes that stopped me. Dark, calculating, and fixed directly on me with an intensity that made my practiced smile falter. He didn't look away when I met his gaze. Instead, the corner of his mouth lifted in something that wasn't quite a smile, more like acknowledgement of a shared secret neither of us had discussed yet. I broke eye contact first, which felt like losing a game I hadn't known I was playing, and moved toward the auction display area. The items up for bid tonight were impressive: a collection of impressionist paintings from a private estate, several pieces of pre-Columbian jewelry, and a stunning Renaissance bronze that I would have killed to restore under different circumstances. I pretended to examine a Monet water lily painting, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. When I glanced over my shoulder, he was closer now, having moved through the crowd with the kind of fluid grace that suggested he was very comfortable in spaces designed to intimidate. He was talking to an older woman wearing enough diamonds to fund a small museum, but his eyes flickered to me every few seconds, like he was tracking my movement while maintaining social niceties. "Iris Hale," a voice said beside me, and I jumped slightly. It was Constance Hartwell herself, the Foundation's director, a woman in her 60s with impeccable taste and a reputation for being both generous and shrewd. "I'm so glad you could make it tonight. How are you holding up?" The question was delivered with genuine concern, which somehow made it worse. I gave her my practiced smile, the one I'd perfected in front of the mirror. "I'm well, thank you for inviting me. The collection tonight is extraordinary." She studied me for a moment, and I could see her cataloging the lies in my expression, but she was too polite to call me out on it. "Malcolm would have loved this. He was always passionate about making art accessible." The mention of his name was a knife between my ribs, but I kept smiling. "He would have bid on everything and bankrupted himself doing it." Constance laughed, squeezed my arm gently, and moved on to greet other guests. I was left standing alone again, clutching my champagne glass like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. That's when I felt a presence beside me, close enough that I could smell expensive cologne and something else. Something darker, like leather and smoke. "That smile doesn't reach your eyes." The voice was deep, measured, with a slight accent I couldn't quite place. British, maybe, but softened by time spent elsewhere. I turned and found myself face to face with the man who'd been watching me all night. Up close, he was even more striking. Sharp cheekbones, a jaw that could cut glass, and those dark eyes that seemed to see straight through the performance I'd been giving for the past 6 months. "Excuse me?" I said, trying to sound offended but mostly just surprised by his directness. "Your smile," he repeated, gesturing slightly toward my face with the whiskey glass in his hand. "It's technically perfect. Good muscle control, appropriate eye crinkling, but there's no joy behind it. Just practiced muscle memory. I'm curious what killed it. I should have walked away." This man was clearly dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with physical threat, and everything to do with the way he looked at people like they were puzzles to be solved. But 6 months of playing nice with police who did nothing, lawyers who were useless, and art world colleagues who abandoned me had left me tired of performing. "Why do you care?" I asked, taking a sip of champagne to steady myself. He smiled then, a real one that transformed his entire face from intimidating to devastating. "Because I've spent the last 30 minutes watching you move through this room like a ghost at your own funeral, and I find ghosts far more interesting than the living. Also because you look directly at Marcus Doyle with the kind of hatred that usually precedes either a brilliant revenge or a total breakdown, and I'd like to know which one I'm about to witness." The fact that he'd noticed, that he'd read the situation so accurately, should have frightened me. Instead, it felt like relief. Someone finally saw through the pretense. "You don't know me," I said, but it came out weaker than I intended. "No," he agreed, "but I know men like Doyle, parasites who build empires on other people's talent, and I know the look of someone who's been systematically destroyed by people who should be in prison but aren't because the system is designed to protect them." He paused, studying me with those unnerving dark eyes. So, I'll ask you again, and you have 3 seconds to decide if you're going to keep lying or tell me the truth. Who killed your smile, Iris Hale? The use of my name, which I hadn't given him, should have been a red flag. But I was so tired of carrying the weight alone, of pretending everything was fine when my entire life had been demolished. So I told him, not everything, not yet, but enough. 8 men, I said quietly, aware that we were in a public space where anyone could overhear. They stole years of my restoration research, used it to authenticate forgeries worth millions, and when the operation was exposed, they made sure the blame fell on me and my mentor, Malcolm Winters. Maybe you heard about him. He died of a heart attack 3 months ago, surrounded by accusations he never got to defend himself against. The man's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a coldness that made the temperature around us drop several degrees. And these 8 men, they're all here tonight. I nodded toward Marcus. That's one of them. The others are scattered across the city, the country, living their lives like nothing happened. The police say they're building a case, but it's been 6 months and nothing. Meanwhile, I can't get work. Museums won't return my calls, and Malcolm's legacy is ruined. He was quiet for a long moment, swirling the whiskey in his glass thoughtfully. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, but carried the weight of certainty. What if I told you I could make this right? Not legally, not through the courts that have already failed you, but in ways that are far more permanent and satisfying. I should have said no, should have walked away from this clearly dangerous man who was offering things that no legitimate person could deliver. But I was so tired of being good, of following rules that only applied to people like me, while men like Marcus Doyle operated with impunity. Who are you? I asked instead. He extended his hand, and when I took it, his grip was firm and warm. Adrian Kane. And I'm someone who solves problems that the legal system can't or won't address. I'm also someone who appreciates fine art, talented women, and the poetry of watching parasites get what they deserve. The gala continued around us, oblivious to the fact that I'd just shaken hands with a man who'd essentially offered to commit crimes on my behalf. Adrian Kane didn't elaborate on what making it right meant, and I didn't ask. Instead, he guided me toward the terrace with a hand barely touching the small of my back, a gesture that was simultaneously chivalrous and possessive. The cool night air hit my face, and I realized I'd been holding my breath inside the crowded ballroom. We weren't alone on the terrace. Several other guests were scattered around enjoying cigarettes and private conversations, but Adrian led me to a corner partially hidden by climbing roses that had been trained over a trellis. The string quartet music drifted out through the open doors, mingling with the sound of the fountain in the garden below. "Tell me about the 8 men," he said, leaning against the stone balustrade with casual elegance. "Not just what they did, but who they are. Names, locations, what makes them untouchable." I should have refused, should have made polite excuses and returned to the safety of the crowd. But standing there in the moonlight with a dangerous stranger who actually listened, actually cared about the details of my destruction, I found myself talking. I told him about Marcus Doyle, who ran a prestigious gallery in Soho and had connections with half the museum directors in the country. About Vincent Russo, who owned a restoration supply company and had used his access to my materials orders to replicate my techniques. About James Whitmore, the auction house specialist, who'd authenticated the forgeries using my stolen methodology. I listed all 8 names, their businesses, their addresses, everything I'd compiled during sleepless nights when grief and rage kept me staring at my ceiling. Adrian listened without interrupting, occasionally sipping his whiskey, his expression unreadable in the dim light. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and I suddenly felt foolish for having revealed so much to a complete stranger. "I'm sorry," I said, wrapping my arms around myself against the evening chill. I don't know why I told you all of that. You must think I'm insane. He pushed off the balustrade and moved closer, near enough that I could see gold flecks in his dark eyes. I think you're someone who's been failed by every system meant to protect you. I think you're someone who deserves justice, even if that justice comes from unconventional sources. And I think you're far more interesting than anyone else in that ballroom. You still haven't told me what you actually do, I said, trying to regain some sense of control over this conversation that had spun wildly beyond normal gala small talk. I acquire things, he said simply. Art, antiquities, objects of value that have gone missing or been stolen. Sometimes I return them to their rightful owners. Sometimes I facilitate their movement to people who appreciate them more than those who originally possessed them. I operate in the spaces between legal and illegal, and I'm very good at what I do. The implication was clear. Adrian Kane was a criminal, probably a high-level art thief, definitely someone I should walk away from immediately. But he was also offering me something the police, the lawyers, and the entire justice system hadn't been able to deliver. Actual consequences for the men who'd destroyed my life. What would making this right look like? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, and it wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a predator who'd just spotted prey. That depends on what you want. If you want them scared, that's simple. If you want them ruined financially, that takes more time, but it's doable. If you want them to disappear. He let the sentence hang in the air between us, unfinished, but clear. I felt a thrill run through me that was equal parts terror and excitement. This man was offering me revenge, real revenge, not the symbolic kind where I wrote think pieces about the flaws in the art world or gave interviews about being a victim. He was offering me the kind of revenge that had weight and permanence. I want them to understand what they took from me, I said finally. I want them to feel the fear Malcolm felt when his life's work was questioned. I want them to lose sleep, to look over their shoulders, to know that their actions have consequences even if the law won't enforce them. Adrian's smile widened. That's a good answer. Specific enough to be actionable, vague enough to give me room to work. I can do that for you, Iris. In fact, I'd enjoy doing it. But I need you to understand something first. He moved even closer, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off his body in the cool night air. Once I start, there's no going back. These men will know someone is coming for them, and they'll react. Some will run, some will fight. And when it's over, the landscape of your world will be different. You need to be sure this is what you want. I thought about Malcolm's funeral, the small crowd of people who'd shown up, how I'd stood in the rain watching them lower his casket into the ground, while Marcus Doyle and his associates were probably celebrating another successful sale. I thought about the sleepless nights, the panic attacks, the way I couldn't look at a painting anymore without seeing all the ways it could be forged, corrupted, destroyed. I thought about my practiced smile in the mirror and how empty I felt performing normalcy for a world that had abandoned me. I'm sure, I said. Adrian studied me for a long moment, and I had the sense he was making some kind of calculation, weighing risk against reward in ways I couldn't comprehend. Then he nodded. Good. In that case, consider it done. You'll start seeing results within a week. Don't ask me for details. Don't try to contact me. And for God's sake, don't talk to the police if they start asking questions. Can you do that? How will I know it's working? I asked. You'll know, he said simply. The men who killed your smile will start disappearing from your world, one by one. Some literally, some figuratively, but all of them permanently. And Iris? He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear in a gesture that was surprisingly intimate. When this is over, when you can finally breathe again, I'm going to ask you to dinner. And I want you to say yes. Before I could respond, he was gone, moving back through the terrace doors into the gala, with the same fluid grace he'd exhibited all evening. I stood alone in the moonlight, my heart pounding, wondering what I'd just set in motion, and why the prospect of having dinner with a criminal felt less dangerous than the life I'd been living for the past 6 months. I stayed on the terrace for another 10 minutes, trying to process what had just happened. The rational part of my brain was screaming that I'd made a terrible mistake, that I'd just enlisted the help of someone who was probably going to make everything worse. But the exhausted, grief-stricken, angry part of me felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not the fragile, desperate hope that the police would suddenly become competent, or that the art world would magically forgive me. This was darker, sharper hope, the kind that came with teeth and claws, and the promise of blood. When I finally went back inside, the auction was in full swing. I watched from the back of the room as paintings and sculptures sold for astronomical amounts, money flowing freely among people who viewed art as investment rather than soul. Marcus Doyle won the bidding on a small Degas, looking pleased with himself as he accepted congratulations from his circle of sycophants. I wondered which of the 8 he'd be, the first to disappear or the last. I wondered if he'd see it coming. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. I made small talk, smiled my practiced smile, and pretended to be the professional art restorer, who was definitely fine and absolutely not conspiring with a criminal mastermind I'd met 2 hours ago. When I finally made it back to my apartment around midnight, I collapsed on my couch, still wearing my gown, and stared at my phone. No calls, no messages, no evidence that the conversation on the terrace had even happened. I pulled up a search for Adrian Kane and found nothing. Well, not nothing. There were several Adrian Kanes in the world: a dentist in Ohio, a real estate agent in Florida, a professor of medieval literature in Scotland, but none that matched the man I'd met tonight. It was like he didn't exist, which probably meant he was very good at what he did. I changed out of my gown and into pajamas, washed off the carefully applied makeup, and stared at myself in the bathroom mirror. My face looked different somehow, like something had shifted beneath the surface. The practiced smile was gone, replaced by an expression I couldn't quite name. Anticipation, maybe. Or the beginning of transformation. I thought about what Adrian had said, about how I'd been moving through the gala like a ghost at my own funeral. He wasn't wrong. For 6 months, I'd been haunting my own life, going through the motions of existence without actually living. Maybe that was about to change. Maybe accepting help from someone who operated outside the law was exactly what I needed to start feeling human again. Or maybe I was justifying making a deal with the devil because I was too tired to keep fighting alone. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I kept replaying the conversation, analyzing every word, every gesture, trying to determine if Adrian Kane was genuine, or if I'd just been manipulated by someone with a different agenda. But every time I circled back to doubt, I remembered the way he'd looked at Marcus Doyle, the cold calculation in his eyes that promised consequences. Whatever Adrian's motivations were, I believed he would do what he'd promised. The question was whether I could live with what came next. I finally fell asleep around 3 a.m, and I dreamed of paintings that restored themselves, of forgeries burning in flames that didn't consume the originals, of Malcolm standing in his study smiling at me with approval that felt like blessing, or warning, or both. The first one disappeared on Tuesday morning. I was having coffee at my kitchen table, scrolling through Art World news on my tablet, when I saw the headline, "Prominent gallery owner Marcus Doyle missing, apartment found empty." I nearly dropped my coffee mug. The article was brief, stating that Doyle had failed to show up for an important client meeting. His gallery staff couldn't reach him, and when police checked his apartment, it appeared he'd left in a hurry. His passport was missing, his safe was empty, and his phone was going straight to voicemail. The article speculated about financial troubles or a personal crisis, but there was no mention of foul play, no evidence of a struggle. He'd simply vanished into thin air. I sat staring at the screen for a long moment, my heart racing. It had been exactly 5 days since the gala. 5 days since Adrian Kane had promised to make things right. And now Marcus Doyle, the man who'd laughed at that same gala while I watched, was gone. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "One down. Don't thank me yet." I stared at the message, my fingers hovering over the keyboard, debating whether to respond. But Adrian had been clear about not contacting him, so I simply deleted the text and tried to go about my day as if my entire world hadn't just shifted on its axis. The art world was buzzing with speculation. I got 3 calls from former colleagues asking if I'd heard about Marcus, their voices tinged with both concern and curiosity. I played dumb, expressed appropriate surprise, and got off the phone as quickly as possible. But inside, I was experiencing something complicated and dangerous. Satisfaction. Dark, guilty satisfaction that one of the men who'd destroyed my life was now experiencing consequences. That evening, I was working in my home studio, trying to restore a small 18th century portrait for one of the few clients who still trusted me, when someone knocked on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and my first paranoid thought was that it was the police, that somehow they'd connected me to Marcus's disappearance. But when I checked the peephole, I saw a delivery driver holding a large flat package. I opened the door cautiously. "Iris Hale?" the driver asked, checking his electronic tablet. "Yes," I confirmed, signing for the package even as my mind raced about what it could be. The driver left, and I carried the package to my studio, my hands shaking slightly as I carefully cut away the protective wrapping. Inside was a painting, and not just any painting. It was a small Dutch Golden Age still life, the kind of work that museums killed for, depicting a table laden with fruit, a half-peeled lemon, and a silver pitcher that seemed to glow with inner light. But what made me gasp was the signature in the corner. This was a real Jan van Huysum, a master whose works were worth millions. Tucked into the frame was a small card with neat handwriting, recovered from Monsieur Doyle's private collection. Apparently, he acquired it through less than legitimate means 5 years ago. "I thought you might appreciate returning it to its rightful place, or keeping it. Dealer's choice." I stared at the painting, my mind reeling. This wasn't just revenge on Marcus. Adrian was returning stolen art, righting wrongs that went beyond just my personal grievance. The Van Huysum alone was worth at least $2 million, and Marcus had been sitting on it in his private collection, probably purchased with money from the forgery operation. I called the Davenport Museum, where the painting had been reported stolen in 2019, and spoke with their director, Caroline Chen, whom I'd worked with years ago. "Caroline, this is Iris Hale. I have something extraordinary to tell you." Within 3 hours, I was sitting in her office while authentication experts examined the Van Huysum with the kind of reverence usually reserved for religious relics. Caroline kept looking at me with questions in her eyes, questions about how I'd come to possess a stolen masterpiece worth millions. I stuck to the story I'd prepared. It had been delivered anonymously with a note suggesting I authenticate it and return it to its rightful owners. "But why you?" Caroline asked, her sharp eyes studying me. "Why would someone send this to you specifically?" I shrugged, trying to look as confused as she was. Maybe because of my reputation for restoration? Maybe because whoever took it from Doyle wanted it returned properly? It was a weak explanation, but Caroline was too excited about recovering the Van Huysum to press too hard. The museum announced the recovery the next morning, praising an anonymous source working with restoration specialist Iris Hale for returning the stolen masterpiece. My phone exploded with calls and messages. Suddenly, people who'd been avoiding me for months wanted to talk, wanted to know how I'd facilitated this incredible recovery. My name was in the art world news again, but this time in a positive context. It felt like oxygen after months of suffocating. The second disappearance happened on Friday. Vincent Russo, who owned the restoration supply company, failed to show up for a major trade convention in Chicago. His business partner told reporters that Vincent had received a threatening phone call 2 days earlier and seemed terrified, talking about leaving the country. By Saturday, confirmation came that Vincent had withdrawn his entire savings, packed a single suitcase, and boarded a flight to Buenos Aires. He'd effectively vanished, leaving his business, his apartment, and his life behind. I received another text from the unknown number. 2. The others are getting nervous. Watch the news next week. I was beginning to understand Adrian's method. He wasn't killing these men, at least not obviously. He was making them run, forcing them to abandon everything they'd built on the foundation of their crimes. It was elegant in its cruelty, making them choose exile over facing whatever consequences he'd promised. But more than that, each disappearance was shaking the art world, raising questions about the forgery operation, putting pressure on the remaining members of the group. Over the weekend, I received another package. This time it contained a complete dossier on the forgery operation, meticulously documented with transaction records, authentication certificates, and even recorded conversations between the 8 men discussing how to use my research. The accompanying note read, "Thought you might want to give this to someone who can actually do something with it. Suggest the FBI art crime team. They're more competent than local police." I stared at the documents, realizing Adrian had compiled evidence that would absolutely destroy the remaining 6 men if it ever became public. But rather than taking it straight to the authorities, he'd given it to me, letting me decide how to use it. I spent the entire weekend reading through the documents, feeling my anger crystallize into something colder and more focused. These men had been so arrogant, so confident in their immunity, that they'd documented everything. There were emails about disposing of Malcolm's credibility, conversations about how to redirect blame onto me, even jokes about how easy it was to manipulate the investigation. By Monday morning, I'd made my decision. I called Agent Sarah Morrison at the FBI art crime team, someone I'd worked with years ago on a recovery case. We met at a cafe in downtown, far from the art world's usual haunts. "I need to show you something," I said, sliding a USB drive across the table. "But first, you need to promise me that you'll actually follow through. No more bureaucratic delays, no more building a case while these men walk free." Sarah looked at me for a long moment, then nodded. "Show me what you've got." The documents I'd given her were explosive. Within 48 hours, the FBI had raided the offices and homes of the remaining 6 men in the operation. James Whitmore, the auction house specialist, was arrested at his desk. 2 others, Peter Morrison and David Chang, turned themselves in immediately. But the last 3, sensing the walls closing in, made different choices. Robert Kensington fled to Monaco, where extradition would be complicated. Thomas Brennan tried to run but was picked up at the airport, and Gregory Walsh, the final member, simply disappeared the night before the raids, vanishing as completely as Marcus and Vincent had. I received one final text from the unknown number. All 8 accounted for. 3 in custody, 3 in exile, 2 fled prosecution. Your smile looks better already. Dinner on Friday. I'll send details. Don't even think about saying no. I found myself smiling. A real smile, for the first time in months. The FBI raids made national news. The forgery operation was exposed in detail, and Malcolm's name was finally, officially cleared. Museums issued statements. Auction houses apologized, and suddenly everyone wanted to talk about the injustice that had been done to both of us. My phone rang constantly with interview requests, job offers, invitations to speak at conferences. The art world's memory was conveniently short, and now that the truth was public, everyone wanted to be on the right side of history. I turned down most of the requests, but I did accept an invitation to give a lecture at Malcolm's former university, talking about ethics in restoration and the importance of protecting researchers from exploitation. Standing at that podium, looking out at students who reminded me of myself 20 years ago, I felt something shift in my chest. The weight I'd been carrying started to lift. That Friday evening, a car service arrived at my apartment at 7 o'clock sharp. The driver handed me a note. Thought you might enjoy a proper thank you dinner. Address is pre-programmed. Wear something that makes you feel powerful. I changed 3 times before settling on a black dress that was elegant without being overly formal, paired with the vintage emerald earrings Malcolm had given me when I completed my first major restoration. Looking at myself in the mirror, I realized my smile had changed. It wasn't the practiced empty expression I'd been wearing for months. There was life in it now, and something else too. Anticipation. The car took me to an address in the warehouse district, which seemed unusual for a dinner venue, until we pulled up to a converted industrial building with subtle lighting and a single unmarked door. The driver opened my door with a professional nod. Mr. Kane is expecting you on the top floor. I took the private elevator up, my heart beating faster with each floor we climbed. When the doors opened, I stepped into a space that took my breath away. The entire top floor had been converted into a private gallery and living space, with exposed brick walls, soaring ceilings, and track lighting that showcased an absolutely stunning collection of art. But these weren't just any paintings. Every piece I could see was a masterwork, the kind of thing that should be in major museums. A small Vermeer, a Caravaggio sketch, a Chinese scroll that had to be from the Tang dynasty, a bronze sculpture that I was almost certain was a lost Donatello. This was a fortune in art, and all of it probably stolen. Adrian stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, wearing dark slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, looking simultaneously relaxed and dangerous. "Welcome to my collection," he said, gesturing around the space. "I thought you'd appreciate seeing what I've been recovering over the years." I walked slowly through the room, my professional eye cataloging each piece while my moral compass spun wildly. "These should be in museums," I said, stopping in front of the Caravaggio. "Some of them," he agreed, coming to stand beside me. "And eventually, they will be. I acquire art that's been stolen or lost, keep it safe, study it, and then return it to appropriate institutions when the time is right. Think of me as a very private, very illegal temporary custodian." "That's not how the law sees it," I pointed out, though my voice lacked conviction. He smiled. "The law also failed to protect you, failed Malcolm, and would have let those 8 men continue operating indefinitely. I work in the spaces where the law is inadequate. He wasn't wrong, and that bothered me more than the stolen art surrounding us. Adrian had done in 2 weeks what the entire justice system couldn't do in 6 months. He'd returned stolen pieces, exposed criminals, and given me back something I thought I'd lost forever. The ability to breathe without carrying the weight of injustice. "Thank you," I said quietly. "For all of it." He moved closer, near enough that I could see the complexity in his dark eyes. Layers of intelligence and danger, and something that might have been loneliness. "Don't thank me yet. We're just getting started." Dinner was served in the gallery space, a small table set up between a Monet water lily and what I was fairly certain was a lost Titian. The food was exquisite, some kind of Mediterranean fusion prepared by a chef who'd apparently been briefed on my preferences, which meant Adrian had been researching me as thoroughly as he'd researched the 8 men. We ate and talked, and I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't in months. Adrian was brilliant, educated in art history and classical literature, with opinions on restoration ethics that surprised me with their thoughtfulness. "I've always believed that art doesn't truly belong to anyone," he said, refilling my wine glass. "Not to the museums that hoard it, not to the collectors who lock it in vaults, not even to the descendants of the artists. Art belongs to itself, and our job is to be worthy custodians for whatever time we have with it." "That's a convenient philosophy for someone who steals paintings for a living," I said, but I was smiling when I said it. He laughed, a rich sound that filled the space. "Touché. But tell me honestly, Iris, that Van Huysum that was sitting in Marcus Doyle's private collection, Seen by no one, appreciated by no one, locked away as a status symbol. And now it's at the Davenport Museum, where thousands of people can experience it, where students can study it, where it can fulfill its purpose as art. Was I wrong to take it from him and give it to you? I wanted to say yes, wanted to maintain the moral high ground, but I couldn't. No, I admitted. You weren't wrong. But the fact that stealing can sometimes be the ethical choice doesn't make the stealing legal. Hence why I have excellent lawyers, he said dryly, and why I'm very careful about who I trust with knowledge of my operations. The conversation shifted to lighter topics. Books we'd read, places we'd traveled, the strange intersection of beauty and commerce that define the art world. I found myself laughing, actually laughing, telling stories about disastrous restoration projects and eccentric collectors. Adrian matched me story for story, describing elaborate heists and close calls with customs agents, painting a picture of a life lived entirely on the edge of legality. When dinner was finished, he led me to a sitting area arranged near the windows. The city lights spread below us like a constellation, and I felt suspended between worlds, between the legitimate art expert I'd been and something else I was becoming. There's something I need to show you, Adrian said, his tone shifting to something more serious. He retrieved a leather portfolio from a nearby cabinet and handed it to me. I recovered this from Gregory Walsh's storage unit before he disappeared. I think you need to see it. I opened the portfolio and felt my breath catch. Inside were dozens of pages from Malcolm's personal research journals, documents I'd thought were lost after his death. But these weren't just random pages. They were the core of his life's work, a comprehensive analysis of Renaissance underpainting techniques that he'd been compiling for 30 years. Walsh stole these? I asked, my hands shaking slightly as I turned the pages. The night Malcolm died, Adrian confirmed. Walsh broke into his study, took the journals, and was planning to publish the research under his own name. The other 7 knew about it, encouraged it even. They saw Malcolm's death as an opportunity to profit from his work one final time. The rage that swept through me was hot and immediate, temporarily displacing the gratitude I'd been feeling. They didn't just ruin his reputation, they robbed his legacy. Yes, Adrian said simply. Which is why I made sure Walsh's disappearance was particularly uncomfortable. He's currently in a country with no extradition treaty and no art world connections, working as a manual laborer because his accounts were frozen and his passport was flagged. He'll spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder. I looked up from the journals to find Adrian watching me with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. Why are you doing all of this? And don't say it's because you appreciate fine art or talented women. There's something else. He was quiet for a long moment, and I thought he might not answer. Then he moved to the window, staring out at the city lights. 5 years ago, I tried to go legitimate. I'd made enough money, acquired enough art to broker deals legally. I opened a gallery, hired staff, did everything by the book. Then a collector accused me of selling him a forgery. It wasn't true. The painting was authentic, and I had documentation proving it. But the collector had connections, and suddenly I was being investigated for fraud. My assets were frozen, and my reputation was destroyed. The charges were eventually dropped, but by then it was too late. The legitimate art world had turned its back on me, and I realized that playing by the rules only works if everyone else is playing by the rules too. He turned back to face me. When I saw you at that gala, I recognized something familiar. The way you moved through that space, how you'd been punished for other people's crimes, how the system that was supposed to protect you had failed spectacularly. I know what it's like to have your professional life destroyed by people who should be in prison but aren't. So yes, I helped you for selfish reasons. Because saving you felt like getting revenge for my own past. Because maybe if I could give you justice, it would matter that I never got any. The honesty in his voice, the vulnerability beneath the dangerous exterior, made something shift in my chest. I stood and crossed to where he was standing, close enough that I could see my reflection in his dark eyes. "You did more than give me justice," I said quietly. "You gave me back my life. My career is recovering, Malcolm's name is cleared, and for the first time in months, I can look at a painting without feeling sick. I don't care if your reasons were selfish. You saved me when no one else would." "Iris," he said, my name a warning or a prayer, I couldn't tell which. Then his hand came up to cup my face, his thumb tracing along my cheekbone with surprising gentleness. "You need to understand something. I'm not a good man. I steal. I break laws. I operate in moral gray areas that would make most people uncomfortable. Getting involved with me means accepting that I'll never be legitimate, never be safe, never be the kind of person you bring home to meet your family. My family consists of an aunt in Oregon who breeds alpacas and sends me Christmas cards," I said, trying to lighten the moment even as my heart raced. "And I don't need good. I tried good, and good abandoned me when things got hard. Maybe what I need is someone who's honest about being morally complicated." He laughed softly, and then he was kissing me, and it felt like falling off a cliff and learning to fly at the same time. His kiss was demanding but patient, thorough but exploratory, the kiss of someone who knew exactly what he wanted and was willing to take his time getting it. When we finally broke apart, I was breathing hard, my carefully constructed walls completely demolished. "Stay," he said, not a question but not quite a command either. "Stay tonight. Let me show you what it's like to live without performing, without pretending, without that practiced smile that doesn't reach your eyes." I should have said no, should have maintained professional distance, kept him at arm's length, protected myself from getting tangled up with a criminal no matter how attractive or helpful he'd been. But I was tired of should, tired of playing it safe in a world that hadn't kept me safe, tired of following rules that only seemed to apply to people like me. So I stayed. We talked until 2 a.m, surrounded by stolen masterpieces and wine glasses, and the comfortable intimacy of two people who'd recognized something broken in each other and decided it was worth fixing. Adrian told me about growing up in London, about how his father had been a museum curator who taught him to see art as stories frozen in time. I told him about Malcolm, about the day I'd discovered restoration and felt like I'd found my purpose, about the panic attacks I'd been having since the scandal broke. When we finally moved to his bedroom, it felt natural, inevitable, like a painting finally revealing the image that had been hidden beneath layers of grime. He was attentive and intense, taking his time, mapping my body like it was a masterpiece he was studying for authentication. Afterwards, lying in his bed with the city lights filtering through the windows, I felt more myself than I had in months. "This is probably a terrible idea," I said, my head on his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "Probably," he agreed, his fingers tracing patterns on my shoulder. "But the best art is always a little bit dangerous. It challenges, it disrupts. It makes you question everything you thought you knew. Why should love be any different?" "Who said anything about love?" I asked, but there was no bite in it. He smiled. I could feel it even without looking at his face. "Give it time. You'll get there." I woke the next morning to the smell of coffee and the sight of Adrian standing at the stove, making breakfast with the same focused intensity he brought to everything else. I borrowed one of his shirts and joined him, feeling simultaneously comfortable and terrified by how natural this felt. We ate breakfast surrounded by art that should have been in museums, and I found myself thinking about ethics, about the line between legal and moral, about how the past 6 months had fundamentally changed my understanding of justice. "I have a proposal for you," Adrian said, refilling my coffee cup. "I need someone I can trust to authenticate pieces I recover. Someone with your expertise and your understanding of how complicated the art world actually is. The pay would be excellent, the work would be fascinating, and you'd be helping return stolen art to its rightful places. Interested?" It was a job offer that would make me complicit in his criminal operations, that would move me from victim of injustice to active participant in vigilante justice. Every rational part of my brain said I should refuse. What would that actually involve? I asked instead. Authenticating pieces I acquire, helping me determine their provenance, advising on the best way to return them to appropriate institutions. Think of it as restoration work. But instead of repairing paintings, you'd be repairing the damage done by thieves and forgers. And if I authenticate something, and you decide to keep it instead of returning it? He met my eyes steadily. Then you'd tell me I was being an ass and making the wrong choice. And I'd listen to you because I respect your opinion, and because you're right, that art belongs in places where people can experience it. I thought about the Van Huysum now hanging in the Davenport Museum. About Malcolm's journals returned to me, so his legacy could be properly preserved. About the 8 men who'd destroyed lives facing actual consequences for the first time. I want to think about it, I said finally. Take all the time you need, he replied. But Iris, whether you accept the job or not, I'm not walking away from this. He gestured between us. From you. Last night wasn't just attraction or convenience. I've spent 5 years being cynical about connection, about letting anyone close enough to matter. But you matter. So think about the job. But don't think about whether we're happening. We're already happening. I spent the next 3 weeks caught between 2 worlds. During the day, I was Iris Hale, legitimate art restoration specialist whose reputation was slowly recovering, thanks to the Van Huysum authentication and Malcolm's exoneration. I took on new clients, gave interviews about ethics in the art world, and started writing the comprehensive guide to restoration techniques that Malcolm had always wanted me to publish. At night, I was becoming someone else entirely. Someone who had drinks with a charming criminal in his gallery of stolen masterpieces. Someone who authenticated a Rembrandt sketch that Adrian had recovered from a corrupt collector in Moscow. Someone who was falling dangerously in love with a man who solved problems by making people disappear. The art world gossip machine eventually connected me to Adrian, though no one knew the full extent of our relationship or his activities. Iris Hale, seen with mysterious art consultant Adrian Kane, read one industry blog, accompanied by a photo someone had snapped of us leaving a gallery opening together. The speculation ranged from professional collaboration to romantic involvement, and I did nothing to clarify because the truth was too complicated to explain. Maya confronted me over lunch at our usual cafe 3 weeks after the gala. Okay, spill. Who is this Adrian Kane person? And why do you look like someone who's been getting very good sleep and very thorough orgasms? I nearly choked on my latte. Subtle as always, Maya. Subtlety is overrated. Come on, Iris. You've been glowing lately. Actually glowing. After months of looking like a sad Victorian ghost. This man is clearly doing something right. Tell me everything. And I mean everything, including the parts that are going to make me jealous. I told her an edited version, the basic facts about meeting Adrian at the gala, how he'd helped expose the forgery operation, how we'd started dating. I left out the criminal empire, the stolen art, the fact that he'd orchestrated the disappearance of 8 men. Some things were better kept private, especially from a best friend who was a litigation attorney with a strong sense of civic duty. He sounds too good to be true, Maya said, studying me with her lawyer eyes. Attractive, intelligent, helped you expose criminals and treats you well? What's the catch? He's complicated, I said carefully. His business operates in gray areas. Not everything he does is strictly legal. Maya's eyebrows rose. How not strictly legal are we talking? Tax evasion, art theft, international crime syndicate? I can neither confirm nor deny, I said, trying to make it sound like a joke, even though it was basically the truth. She leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting from curiosity to concern. Iris, I love you, and I'm thrilled you're happy again. But please tell me you're being careful. The last thing you need after everything you've been through is to get tangled up in something that could blow up your newly recovered reputation. I'm being careful, I assured her, which was only partially true. What I was actually being was reckless, impulsive, and completely unable to stop myself from getting more deeply involved with Adrian every day that passed. That evening, Adrian picked me up from my apartment in his sleek black car, which was definitely too expensive for someone whose official job title was vague art consultant. "I have something to show you," he said, that slight smile playing around his lips that usually meant he'd done something either impressive or illegal, or both. We drove to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, one of several properties he owned under various corporate shells. Inside, the space had been converted into a climate-controlled storage facility, with row after row of art carefully wrapped and catalogued. "This is my active recovery collection," he explained, leading me down the aisles. "Pieces I've acquired that are waiting for the right moment to be returned to their rightful owners. I thought you might help me determine priorities, which pieces should go back first, which institutions would be most appropriate, that sort of thing." I moved through the collection with growing amazement. There were dozens of significant works here, paintings and sculptures and antiquities that museums had mourned as lost. A small Botticelli, a Tang Dynasty horse sculpture, several illuminated manuscripts, a collection of pre-Columbian goldwork. It was a treasure trove of art history, all of it stolen, all of it waiting for Adrian to facilitate its return. "This must be worth hundreds of millions," I said, stopping in front of what appeared to be a missing panel from a medieval altarpiece. "More," he confirmed. "But the value isn't in what I could sell them for. It's in returning them to places where they can be properly appreciated. I steal from thieves, Iris. That's my specialty. I find art that's been taken, and I liberate it. Sometimes I return it immediately, sometimes I hold it until the political situation is right, but everything here will eventually go back." "Why tell me all this?" I asked, turning to face him. "Why bring me into your operation so completely? You have to know this makes me complicit." "Because I trust you," he said simply. "And because I want you to see the full picture before you make a decision about the job I offered. This isn't just about authenticating the occasional piece. It's about being my partner in a project to repatriate stolen art, to correct injustices that museums and governments either can't or won't address. It's illegal, morally complicated, and potentially dangerous. But it's also important work, and I think you understand that better than most people." He was right. I did understand. Every piece in this warehouse represented not just monetary value, but cultural heritage, human creativity, the connection between past and present. The fact that Adrian had to operate outside the law to return these pieces to their proper places said more about the failures of the legitimate system than it did about his criminality. "I'll do it," I said. "I'll work with you, help you return these pieces, be your partner in this completely illegal, but somehow ethical enterprise, on one condition." "Name it," he said, moving closer. "I want you to promise me that you'll actually return them, that this isn't just a sophisticated cover story for art theft. I need to know that the work we're doing has integrity, even if it doesn't have legality." He took my hands in his dark eyes serious. "I promise. Every piece in this warehouse will go back to where it belongs. You have my word, and for what it's worth, my word is the one thing I've never broken. I may be a thief and a criminal, but I have standards." I believed him. Maybe I was being naive. Maybe I was being manipulated by an attractive criminal with a talent for persuasion. But looking into his eyes, I believed him. We sealed the agreement with a kiss that quickly turned heated and ended up making love against one of the storage units, surrounded by millions of dollars in stolen art, creating our own masterpiece of questionable ethics and undeniable passion. Over the following months, I became Adrian's official partner in his recovery operations. We developed a rhythm, a system. He would acquire pieces through his network of contacts, informants, and occasional heists. I would authenticate them, research their provenance, and help determine the best institutions for their return. Sometimes we returned things anonymously. Sometimes we worked with museum directors I trusted to facilitate recoveries without involving law enforcement. Sometimes we got creative. One of my favorite recoveries involved a Vermeer that had been stolen from a small museum in the Netherlands 20 years earlier. The museum couldn't afford proper security. The painting had been taken in a smash-and-grab robbery, and the insurance payout had barely covered the damaged wall. Adrian had acquired it from a collector in Dubai, who'd bought it from the original thieves. Instead of just returning it, we orchestrated an elaborate discovery where I was invited to authenticate a possibly fake Vermeer that had mysteriously appeared in a storage locker. I confirmed it as authentic. The museum got their painting back with international press coverage that boosted their profile, and Adrian and I celebrated with champagne in his gallery. "We're getting good at this," I said, curled up on his couch with a glass of expensive wine. "Maybe too good. I'm starting to enjoy the criminality a little too much." He laughed, pulling me closer. "There are worse addictions than ethical theft and righteous recovery. Besides, you're not enjoying the criminality. You're enjoying the justice. Big difference." Life fell into a pattern that was equal parts exhilarating and terrifying. I maintained my legitimate restoration practice, taking on high-profile projects that continued to rebuild my professional reputation. But my real passion was the work I did with Adrian, the recovery operations that returned cultural heritage to its proper places. We traveled together, ostensibly for art consultations, but actually to acquire and return pieces. We attended galas and openings, networking with collectors and curators who had no idea they were talking to one of the world's most successful art thieves. We became partners in every sense of the word, professional and personal, building something that existed outside normal definitions of legality or morality. 6 months after the gala where we'd first met, Adrian received intelligence about a major score. Someone in his network had information about a Caravaggio that had been stolen from a church in Italy 50 years ago. The painting, the Nativity with St. Francis and St. Lawrence, was one of the world's most wanted missing artworks, valued at over $20 million. The current owner was a Russian oligarch with connections to organized crime, and acquiring it would require planning, resources, and considerable risk. "This could be the biggest recovery we've attempted," Adrian said, spreading intelligence reports across his desk. "It's also the most dangerous. If we're caught, there's no explaining this away as a misunderstanding. We'd both go to prison." I studied the reports, the photographs of the Caravaggio, the details about the oligarch's security systems. "When do we leave for Moscow?" I asked. He looked at me for a long moment. "You understand what you're agreeing to. This isn't just authenticating a piece after I've acquired it. This is active participation in theft, international crime, the works. No more plausible deniability." "I crossed that line months ago," I said. "Besides, this painting belongs in that church in Italy, where normal people can see it, not locked in some oligarch's mansion as a status symbol. We're not stealing it. We're liberating it." "You're starting to sound like me," he said, but he was smiling. "That's probably a bad sign. Or a sign that I've finally figured out who I am," I countered. "Someone who understands that justice doesn't always wear a black robe and sit behind a bench. Sometimes justice wears a black turtleneck and breaks into vaults to return stolen art." We spent 2 weeks planning the Moscow operation. Adrian's contacts provided intelligence about the oligarch's security systems, guard rotations, and travel schedules. I researched the Caravaggio's condition, prepared the materials we'd need to safely transport it, and studied the provenance documentation to ensure we were recovering the real painting and not one of the several forgeries that had surfaced over the years. The night before we left for Moscow, we had dinner at Adrian's gallery, surrounded by the art we'd recovered together. "Are you scared?" I asked, watching him study a small Monet we were preparing to return to a museum in France. "Terrified," he admitted. "This is the most ambitious thing I've attempted, and I'm doing it with someone He paused, and I saw vulnerability flash across his usually composed features. With someone I've fallen in love with, which means the stakes are higher than they've ever been. My heart stuttered at the words. We'd been dancing around this declaration for months, both of us feeling it, but neither quite brave enough to say it. I love you too, I said quietly, which is probably insane given that you're a criminal, and I'm complicit in your crimes, and this entire situation is ethically complicated and potentially disastrous. But, he prompted, moving closer, but I don't care. I tried doing everything right, following every rule, being the good girl who colored inside the lines. And it got me nowhere. You showed me that sometimes the right thing requires breaking rules, that justice doesn't always come through official channels, and that loving someone complicated is better than not loving anyone at all. He kissed me then, deep and thorough, a kiss that felt like a promise, and a beginning, and a point of no return, all at once. When we get back from Moscow, he said against my lips, when we've successfully recovered the Caravaggio and returned it to that church in Italy, I'm going to ask you to marry me. Fair warning. I laughed, pulling him closer. Fair warning received, and for the record, I'm going to say yes. Moscow in March was cold, gray, and absolutely perfect for criminal activity. We arrived separately, staying in different hotels, maintaining the appearance of being unconnected art consultants visiting for a private auction. Adrian's intelligence was solid. The oligarch, Viktor Sokolov, was hosting a party at his country estate, 3 hours outside Moscow, and would be gone from his city mansion for 48 hours. His security would be minimal, just a skeleton crew, and the Caravaggio was kept in a climate-controlled vault in his study. Breaking in would be the easy part. Getting out without triggering alarms or leaving evidence would be the challenge. The security system is state-of-the-art, Adrian explained when we met at a safe house on the third day. But it has one vulnerability. During the monthly maintenance cycle, there's a 4-minute window when the backup generators are being tested and the system switches between power sources. We go in during that window, access the vault using the codes I acquired from a very well-paid security consultant, remove the Caravaggio, replace it with a forgery good enough to pass casual inspection, and exit before the system comes back online. 4 minutes to locate a painting in a mansion we've never been inside and get out? I said. That's ambitious even for you. Which is why we've practiced the route 17 times using the mansion blueprints and why you're going to be spectacular, he said with confidence I didn't entirely feel. The night of the operation, I dressed in all black, my hands shaking slightly as I pulled on thin gloves that would leave no fingerprints. Adrian drove us to the mansion in a nondescript rental car, parking 2 blocks away in a spot his advance team had confirmed was outside camera range. We moved through the darkened streets like shadows, and I felt my heart pounding so loudly I was sure the whole neighborhood could hear it. The mansion loomed ahead of us, a modern monstrosity of glass and steel that screamed new money and no taste. Adrian led me to a service entrance, using a key card he'd somehow acquired to bypass the lock. We were inside, moving quickly and silently through corridors lined with mediocre contemporary art that Viktor Sokolov probably thought was impressive. The study was on the 2nd floor, behind a door that required both a key card and a numerical code. Adrian handled both with practiced ease, and then we were inside, facing a wall-size safe that looked like it could withstand a nuclear blast. 3 minutes, Adrian murmured, checking his watch as he went to work on the vault. I stood watch by the door, my every sense heightened, listening for footsteps or voices that would indicate security making their rounds. Time seemed to simultaneously slow down and speed up, each second stretching out while the minutes ticked away far too quickly. There was a soft beep, and the vault door swung open. Adrian moved inside, and I followed, my breath catching at what I saw. The vault was full of art, legitimate pieces alongside obvious fakes, all of it jumbled together with no regard for value or historical significance. And there, mounted on the back wall like a trophy, was the Caravaggio. Even in the dim light of the vault, it was breathtaking. The nativity scene glowed with the master's signature use of light and shadow, the figures rendered with emotional intensity that had survived 50 years of being hidden from the world. "It's real," I whispered, moving closer to examine it. "Definitely the original. I can see the pentimenti, the changes Caravaggio made during painting that wouldn't be in a forgery." 1 minute 30 seconds, Adrian said, already carefully removing the painting from its mount. I grabbed the forgery we'd brought, a decent copy that wouldn't fool an expert, but would look right at first glance, and we made the switch. Adrian wrapped the original in protective materials while I positioned the fake exactly as the real one had been displayed. Then we were moving, out of the vault, closing the door behind us, through the study and into the corridor. We made it to the service entrance with 20 seconds to spare before the security system finished its power cycle. The cold Moscow air hit my face like a slap, and I realized I'd been holding my breath. We walked quickly but calmly back to the car, just 2 people out for an evening stroll, and Adrian didn't start the engine until we were safely inside. "We did it," I said, the reality finally hitting me. "We actually did it." "Never doubted it for a second," Adrian said, but I could hear the relief in his voice. We drove straight to the airport, using diplomatic credentials that Adrian had somehow acquired, probably illegally, to bypass customs inspections. The Caravaggio traveled with us in a specially designed case that looked like photography equipment, and 12 hours later we were landing in Rome. We didn't go directly to the church in Palermo where the painting had been stolen from. First, we needed to arrange the return properly, create a narrative that would allow the church to reclaim their masterpiece without awkward questions about where it had been for 50 years. Adrian had a contact at the Vatican, a cardinal who was pragmatic about art recovery, and understood that sometimes getting pieces back required looking the other way about how they were acquired. We met with Cardinal Benedetti in a quiet cafe near St. Peter's Square, the Caravaggio secured in a hotel vault nearby. "You have it?" the cardinal asked in accented English, his elderly face creasing with hope and concern in equal measure. "We do," Adrian confirmed. "The original, verified by Ms. Hale, who is one of the world's leading experts on Caravaggio's technique. It's in perfect condition, considering what it's been through." Cardinal Benedetti's eyes filled with tears. The parish in Palermo never stopped mourning this loss. To have it returned after 50 years, it will be like a miracle. "We need the return to be handled delicately," I said. "Anonymous donation. No questions about where it's been. No investigation that might prevent its return." The cardinal nodded slowly. "I understand. Sometimes God works through mysterious channels. The church is grateful to these mysterious channels." We arranged for the painting to be discovered in a storage room at a Vatican facility, misfiled for decades, a bureaucratic miracle that allowed it to be returned to Palermo without complicated questions. The story was thin, but the church accepted it gratefully, and within 2 weeks, the Caravaggio was back in the oratory of San Lorenzo, where it belonged. The international press coverage was enormous. Art experts celebrated the recovery. The parish in Palermo held a festival, and Adrian and I watched the news coverage from his gallery, drinking champagne and basking in the knowledge that we'd returned something irreplaceable to the world. "That was incredible," I said, curled up against him on the couch. "Terrifying and probably shortened my lifespan by a few years, but incredible." "Ready for the next one?" he asked, that familiar mischief in his eyes. "Always," I said, and meant it. Over the next year, we recovered and returned 17 more significant pieces. A Klimt from Austria, a collection of antiquities from Egypt, several old master drawings from private collections that had no right to own them. Each recovery felt like an act of justice, a small correction in a world full of theft and exploitation. My legitimate restoration practice thrived alongside the criminal enterprise. Museums trusted me, collectors sought my expertise, and universities invited me to lecture. No one suspected that I spent my nights planning heists with the man I loved, that my professional success was built partially on criminal activity, that I'd become someone who viewed the law as optional when it stood between art and its rightful home. Adrian proposed exactly as he'd promised, after we successfully returned a stolen Rembrandt to the Rijksmuseum. We were standing in his gallery, surrounded by the pieces we were preparing to recover next, when he got down on one knee and pulled out a ring that featured a stone I immediately recognized as having been smuggled out of a conflict zone 3 centuries ago. "This belonged to a Mughal empress," he said. "It's been in private collections for 300 years, traded like currency, admired, but never loved. I'm giving it to you because you're someone who understands the difference between possession and appreciation, between owning something and honoring it. Marry me, Iris. Be my partner in all of this, the criminal and the legitimate, the art and the life." I said yes before he finished the question. We were married 3 months later in a small ceremony at his gallery, surrounded by the art we'd recovered together. Maya was my maid of honor, still slightly scandalized by Adrian, but charmed despite herself. Cardinal Benedetti officiated, having decided that our morally complicated work fell into the category of God's mysterious ways. The guest list was small, carefully curated people who either knew about our operations or could be trusted not to ask uncomfortable questions. My wedding dress was vintage Valentino, and I wore the Mughal Empress's ring alongside a simple gold band. Adrian wore Tom Ford and looked like he'd stepped out of a classic film about elegant criminals. We exchanged vows surrounded by a Vermeer, 2 Caravaggios, a Botticelli, and a dozen other masterpieces that were waiting to be returned to their rightful homes. "I promise to love you," I said when it was my turn, "even when you're planning something illegal. I promise to be your partner in recovering what's been stolen, even when it terrifies me. And I promise to always tell you when you're being an idiot about where a painting should go." The guests laughed, and Adrian's eyes crinkled with genuine joy. "I promise to love you," he said, "especially when you're telling me I'm an idiot. I promise to always listen to your expertise, even when I'd rather just keep the art. And I promise that every piece we recover will go back to where it belongs, because that's the kind of people we are. Thieves with principles." The reception was held in the gallery space, catered by the best chef in the city, with wine that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. At some point in the evening, as I was dancing with my new husband surrounded by art that shouldn't be there, but would soon be returned, I caught a glimpse of myself in one of the gallery windows. I was smiling, really smiling, and it reached all the way to my eyes. The practiced, empty expression I'd worn at that charity gala 18 months ago was gone, replaced by genuine joy. "What are you thinking?" Adrian asked, pulling me closer. "That I'm married to a criminal," I said. "That I'm complicit in international art theft. That by all conventional measures, I should be horrified by what my life has become." "But," he prompted, already knowing the answer, "but I've never been happier. The 8 men who destroyed my life are facing consequences. Malcolm's legacy is restored. I'm doing work that actually matters, returning cultural heritage to places where people can experience it. And I'm married to someone who sees me completely and loves me anyway. That's worth a little moral ambiguity." A week after our wedding, we received word about one more recovery, the final piece in the forgery operation that had destroyed my career. Gregory Walsh, the man who'd stolen Malcolm's journals, had surfaced in Buenos Aires, trying to sell a painting he claimed was an authenticated masterpiece. The painting was a fake, of course, one of the forgeries from the original operation, but Walsh was desperate enough to try moving it. Adrian's contacts in South America intercepted the sale, and suddenly we had Walsh in custody, metaphorically speaking. "What do you want to do?" Adrian asked, showing me the intelligence reports. "We could turn him over to the FBI. We could make him disappear like the others. Or we could do something more creative." I thought about it for a long time. Walsh was the last of the 8, the one who'd added insult to injury by stealing Malcolm's life's work. Part of me wanted revenge, wanted to see him suffer as Malcolm had suffered. But another part, the part that had been healed by Adrian's love and our shared work, wanted something different. "Let's return the journals," I said finally. "Let's arrange for Malcolm's complete research to be published posthumously, with full credit to him and acknowledgement of how brilliant his work was. Let's make sure his legacy is so thoroughly restored that Walsh's attempted theft becomes a footnote in the story of a great scholar. That's the best revenge." Adrian smiled, the kind of smile that said I'd made exactly the right choice. "I love you," he said simply. "I love who you are and who you're becoming." 6 months later, the complete restoration journals of Malcolm Winters was published by a prestigious academic press. The book was lauded as groundbreaking, a comprehensive analysis of Renaissance techniques that became required reading in restoration programs worldwide. I wrote the introduction, dedicating the work to my mentor and friend, and included a note about how his research had been stolen but was now being properly recognized. At the launch party, held at a major museum, I gave a speech about Malcolm's legacy, about justice delayed but not denied, about how important work eventually finds its proper place in the world. The art world that had turned its back on us now celebrated Malcolm as the genius he'd always been. As for Gregory Walsh, he was arrested in Buenos Aires trying to sell another fake, his desperation making him sloppy. He was extradited to the United States, tried, and convicted. The last I heard, he was serving a 15-year sentence. Plenty of time to think about the consequences of stealing from better people. My life now exists in the space between legal and moral, between conventional and extraordinary. I run a successful restoration practice, publish papers, give lectures, everything that makes me legitimate in the art world's eyes. But I also work with my husband to recover stolen art, to return cultural heritage to its rightful places, to correct injustices that the legal system can't or won't address. We've recovered over 100 significant pieces in the 3 years since we married. Some returns are public, celebrated recoveries that make international news. Others are quiet, anonymous donations that appear overnight in museum storage rooms. We maintain a delicate balance, building legitimate reputations while operating a criminal enterprise that has arguably done more to repatriate stolen art than most legal efforts. People sometimes ask me if I regret the path I chose, if I wish I'd stayed firmly on the legal side of things. I tell them about the Caravaggio hanging in that church in Palermo, about Malcolm's journals being studied by students worldwide, about the hundreds of thousands of people who've experienced art that would have remained locked in private vaults if not for our work. Adrian was right that night at the gala when he asked who killed my smile. 8 men had killed it, along with a legal system that failed to protect people like me and Malcolm. But he was also the one who brought it back, who showed me that justice doesn't always wear a black robe, that love can be morally complicated and still be real, that sometimes breaking the rules is the most ethical choice available. I'm Iris Kane now, married to a brilliant criminal, complicit in international art theft, and happier than I ever imagined possible. My smile reaches my eyes again, not because I'm pretending or performing, but because I'm finally living a life that feels true. And if that life exists in moral gray areas, well, some of the world's greatest art was created in shadows and light, in the space between what's acceptable and what's extraordinary. We live there now, Adrian and I, in that space between, stealing from thieves, returning what was taken, loving each other with an intensity that doesn't apologize for its complications. They say that restoration is about revealing the original intent of the artist, about removing damage to show what was always meant to be. Maybe that's what Adrian did for me. Maybe he restored me to the person I was always meant to become. Someone who understands that rules are guidelines, that justice is complicated, and that the right thing often requires courage to operate outside conventional boundaries. I wouldn't change any of it. Not the fear, not the risk, not the moral complexity, Because every recovered painting, every returned masterpiece, every piece of cultural heritage restored to its rightful place is proof that we're doing something that matters, something important, something that will outlast both of us. And at the end of the day, that's worth more than following rules that only protect people who don't need protection. That's worth everything.